The Eternal Dominion had been running the galaxy like a particularly pretentious homeowners association for roughly 12,000 years, which was apparently long enough for its leadership to forget that the universe has a wicked sense of humor about beings who start calling themselves gods. The so-called Immortals, a collection of various species who discovered that advanced medical technology and selective breeding could extend lifespans to embarrassing lengths, ruled from their crystal spires on Athros Prime, with all the subtlety of a cosmic temper tantrum. They'd convinced themselves that longevity equaled divinity, which was rather like claiming that owning a particularly old car made you the patron saint of transportation. Nevertheless, they'd managed to subjugate roughly 3/4 of known space through a combination of superior firepower, intimidation tactics, and the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that would make a tax collector weep with envy. Their method was elegantly simple: sweep into a system, demonstrate overwhelming technological superiority by casually rearranging a few moons, then offer the local species a choice between voluntary submission or having their planets turned into particularly expensive gravel. Most civilizations, being fond of continued existence, chose submission. Those who didn't became cautionary tales, told in hushed whispers across 1,000 worlds. The tribute system they'd established was a masterwork of calculated humiliation. Each subjugated species had to provide not just resources and labor, but also their finest specimens, warriors, scholars, artists, to serve in the immortal courts as living symbols of conquest. These individuals were kept as curiosities, trophies to be displayed during state functions and diplomatic gatherings, constant reminders that even the proudest civilizations eventually bent the knee. It was a system that had worked flawlessly for millennia, which should have been the first warning sign that something was about to go spectacularly wrong. The universe, after all, abhors a perfect system almost as much as it abhors a vacuum. The problem began when Scout Fleet Designation 774 discovered a small, unremarkable system during routine expansion operations in the galaxy's outer rim. Third planet from a yellow star, mostly water, inhabited by bipedal mammals who'd barely figured out how to leave their own atmosphere without strapping themselves to controlled explosions. Standard primitive classification, hardly worth the fuel costs to conquer. But Overlord Nixarian of the Fourth Circle, whose actual age was approximately 8,000 years and whose emotional maturity had apparently peaked somewhere around 30, had been having a particularly boring millennium and decided that a quick conquest might provide some entertainment. The humans, he declared with the kind of casual arrogance that cosmic karma just loves to punish, would serve as an amusing example to other border worlds considering resistance. The initial assault was textbook Dominion doctrine: disable orbital defenses, neutralize military installations, capture population centers. The humans fought back with the desperate creativity of a species that had spent most of its evolutionary history trying to kill either each other or everything else on their planet, which made things marginally more interesting than usual, but hardly challenging for a civilization that could manipulate gravity like a particularly advanced yo-yo. What caught the Immortals' attention wasn't the resistance itself. Every species fought back initially, but the particular specimen they captured during the assault on what the humans called the Pentagon. A female soldier, mid-20s by human reckoning, who'd managed to take down 3 Dominion heavy troopers before being subdued, not through superior firepower or technology, but through sheer bloody-minded tactical thinking and an apparent willingness to weaponize anything from office supplies to architectural features. The after-action reports were fascinating reading. If you enjoyed that particular genre of military documentation, where seasoned warriors try to explain how they'd been outsmarted by someone using staplers and fire extinguishers, the human had turned a standard government building into something resembling a 3-dimensional puzzle box designed by someone with serious anger management issues and an engineering degree. Overlord Nixarian, upon reviewing these reports, made the kind of decision that future historians would mark as the precise moment when hubris achieved critical mass. Rather than simply executing the troublesome human or leaving her with the rest of her species to contemplate their new servitude, he ordered her brought to Athros Prime as a personal trophy. She would serve as his newest curiosity, a primitive warrior to be displayed before the court as evidence of his latest conquest. It was, the Overlord declared with the kind of theatrical grandeur that suggested he'd been reading too much of his own propaganda, time to show this upstart species what happened when mortals dared raise weapons against the divine. The human would be broken publicly, systematically, and thoroughly, serving as both entertainment and object lesson. The logistics department, composed of beings whose job it was to make the Immortals' whims reality regardless of practical considerations, dutifully arranged one human female, classified as dangerous primitive specimen, was loaded aboard the luxury transport Divine Will in a containment cell designed for beings far more physically formidable than a bipedal mammal weighing barely 60 kilograms. As the ship departed Earth's orbit, carrying its cargo toward the capital of an empire that had never known defeat, none of the Immortals bothered to consider that perhaps 12,000 years of unchallenged supremacy might have made them just a tiny bit overconfident. After all, what could possibly go wrong? The throne room of Overlord Nixarian was designed with all the subtlety of a monument to narcissism, which was to say none whatsoever. Crystal pillars stretched toward a ceiling that had been engineered to display real-time images of distant galaxies, because apparently regular architecture wasn't impressive enough for beings who considered themselves the universe's middle manager. The floor was composed of some mineral that existed in a perpetual state of perfect reflection, ensuring that everyone who entered was forced to acknowledge their own insignificance in the face of such overwhelming grandeur. It was the kind of room that screamed, "I am very important and definitely not compensating for anything," which should have been another warning sign that its occupant might not be operating from a position of psychological strength. The human was dragged in by two guards whose species had evolved from something resembling a cross between a rhinoceros and a filing cabinet. They'd been selected for this duty primarily because their natural armor made them look appropriately intimidating, and secondarily, because their limited intelligence made them unlikely to question orders that might, upon reflection, seem somewhat questionable. Standard protocol for presenting captives to the Overlord involved a carefully choreographed sequence of humiliation designed to break the spirit before the mind. The prisoner would be forced to their knees, their crimes against the Dominion would be recited in excruciating detail, and then the Overlord would deliver the kind of speech that sounded profound if you didn't think about it too hard. The human, however, appeared to have missed the memo about proper prisoner etiquette. Instead of cowering appropriately, she was examining the throne room with the focused attention of someone conducting a professional assessment. Her eyes tracked the guard positions, cataloged the various technological displays, and lingered particularly long on what appeared to be a gravity manipulation device that was probably meant to look decorative but was actually functional. The kind of attention that suggested she was filing away useful information rather than being appropriately awed by divine majesty. "Behold Overlord Nixarian," intoned, his voice enhanced by acoustic technology that made him sound like the voice of cosmic authority itself. "Another primitive species learns the futility of resistance against the eternal will of interesting acoustics," the human interrupted, which caused several courtiers to make the kind of shocked, gasping sounds usually reserved for witnessing someone commit suicide by bad manners. Sound amplification through resonance chambers built into the architecture. Clever engineering, though the harmonics suggest the system wasn't originally designed for speech. Military application, maybe? Sonic weapon? The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that occurs when an entire room full of beings realizes that their carefully maintained illusion of divine authority has just been casually dissected by someone who apparently thought she was attending a technical seminar. Nixarian, who had been preparing to launch into his usual speech about the insignificance of mortal flesh before eternal power, found himself momentarily derailed. In 12,000 years of accepting tribute and breaking spirits, no one had ever responded to his divine presence by critiquing his interior design choices. "You dare analyze the sacred architecture of sacred?" The human tilted her head with the kind of expression usually seen on engineers who just spotted a design flaw. "It's impressive craftsmanship, sure, but sacred implies some kind of religious significance. This looks more like a command center designed by someone with unlimited budget and questionable taste. Though I have to admit, the gravity manipulation array is genuinely innovative. Is that how you move those moon-sized chunks of rock around? Direct gravitational field manipulation rather than traditional propulsion." One of the courtiers, a being whose species had evolved from something resembling a praying mantis crossed with a corporate executive, leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Is she supposed to be doing that?" The companion, whose own evolutionary background suggested a combination of jellyfish and middle management, whispered back, "I don't think anyone's ever done this before." Nixarian was beginning to experience what lesser beings might recognize as frustration, though he preferred to think of it as righteous indignation at the prisoner's failure to properly appreciate her situation. You stand before immortal power, primitive creature. Your species exists at our sufferance, your world at our mercy. Immortal? The human's eyebrows rose with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than appropriate terror. That's fascinating. True biological immortality. Or are we talking about advanced life extension? Because from what I observed during the invasion, your soldiers showed clear signs of aging, different rates among different species, but definitely senescence. So either you've got some kind of selective immortality treatment, or she paused, studying Nexarian with the kind of clinical attention usually reserved for interesting specimens. You're using immortal in the metaphorical sense. The throne room's atmosphere had shifted from ceremonial intimidation to something resembling a very awkward academic conference. Several guards were exchanging glances that suggested they were beginning to wonder if maybe they should have received additional training for this particular scenario. Nexarian activated one of his favorite intimidation displays, a holographic projection showing the Dominion fleet reducing a rebellious planet to component atoms. It was normally quite effective at inducing proper reverence in difficult prisoners. Witness the fate of those who defy divine will. The human watched the display with professional interest. Impressive firepower. Planet crackers, right? Though that looks like controlled matter-antimatter annihilation rather than pure energy conversion. The containment field geometry is really elegant. Whoever designed that understood exotic physics better than most of our theoretical physicists. How do you manage the magnetic bottle stability at those energy levels? At this point, Overlord Nexarian was beginning to suspect that either his prisoner was completely insane, or that humanity might be a significantly more problematic species than initial reports had suggested. Possibly both. Your insolence will be corrected, he declared, though his voice lacked some of its earlier cosmic authority. You will learn proper reverence for your betters, or you will provide an example to others who might share your primitive misconception. The human smiled, and it wasn't a particularly nice smile. It was the kind of expression that suggested she'd just figured out something important and wasn't entirely displeased by the implications. Oh, she said, her tone conversational. I think I'm learning quite a lot already. And that, though none of the Immortals present realized it yet, was when their perfect system began developing its first hairline crack. 3 days later, Overlord Nexarian had reached the kind of frustrated fury that typically precedes spectacularly poor decision-making. His prisoner had been subjected to every form of psychological intimidation in the Dominion playbook, from exposure to cosmic horrors that had driven entire species to madness, to demonstrations of technology so advanced it might as well have been magic. The human's response to each new horror had been to ask increasingly technical questions about its implementation. When shown the void engines that could unravel the fundamental forces holding matter together, she'd inquired about quantum field manipulation and wondered aloud whether the containment protocols accounted for vacuum decay scenarios. When presented with a device that could rewrite the neural pathways of any sentient being, she'd spent 20 minutes discussing the ethical implications of consciousness modification with a distinctly uncomfortable technician who'd probably never considered that his job might involve moral philosophy. The breaking point came when she was shown the Infinity Archive, a crystalline matrix containing the preserved consciousness of every species the Dominion had ever conquered. It was meant to be the ultimate demonstration of futility. Here were the minds of billions of beings who had once thought themselves free, now trapped in eternal digital servitude as a monument to immortal power. The human had examined the display with the kind of professional interest that suggested she was mentally taking notes. Consciousness transfer and storage, she'd mused. The quantum computing requirements alone must be staggering. How do you maintain coherence across that many parallel processes? And the power consumption, she'd paused, studying the energy conduits feeding the archive. That's interesting. Those look like deliberate inefficiencies in the system architecture. The technician monitoring the display had made the mistake of engaging with her observation. The archive requires approximately 40% of Athros Prime's total energy output to maintain stability, he'd admitted, apparently forgetting that prisoners weren't supposed to receive detailed briefings on critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. 40%. The human had looked genuinely surprised. For consciousness storage? That seems excessive. Unless her expression had shifted to something resembling scientific delight. Unless you're not actually storing consciousness at all. You're running real-time simulations of consciousness, aren't you? That's why the power requirements are so massive. You're not preserving minds, you're recreating them continuously. The technician's uncomfortable silence had been confirmation enough. That evening, Overlord Nexarian had made the kind of decision that future historians would classify under hubris achieving critical mass. Case studies in imperial overconfidence. If traditional intimidation wasn't working, he would resort to the one method that had never failed to break even the most stubborn spirits. Public execution combined with a demonstration of divine wrath that would serve as both entertainment and education for the masses. The Grand Amphitheater of Athros Prime was an architectural marvel that could accommodate roughly 2 million spectators, while simultaneously broadcasting the proceedings to every world in the Dominion. It had been designed specifically for state executions, with viewing angles optimized for maximum psychological impact and acoustic properties that ensured even the quietest death rattle would be audible in the cheapest seat. The prisoner was brought in wearing ceremonial restraints that had been crafted specifically for this occasion, crystalline shackles that would amplify her life signs during the execution process, ensuring that her fear and pain would be shared with every being watching across the galaxy. It was meant to be the final demonstration that even the most defiant spirit could be broken, that the Immortal's power was absolute and eternal. The human examined her restraints with the same clinical interest she'd shown everything else, her fingers tracing the crystal matrices, with what looked disturbingly like professional appreciation. Quantum entanglement for real-time broadcast, clever, though the resonance frequency looks unstable. What happens if you introduce harmonic interference at the base frequency? Nexarian, resplendent in ceremonial armor that cost more than most planets' annual economic output, raised the scepter of final judgment, a weapon that could theoretically erase a target from existence so completely that they would never have existed in the first place. It was the kind of ostentatious overkill that the Dominion specialized in, because why simply kill your enemies when you could make a philosophical statement about the nature of reality? Behold, his voice boomed across the amphitheater and throughout the galaxy. The fate of all who would challenge the eternal order. Witness how divine power reduces mortal defiance to... The human's restraints suddenly began emitting a sound that could best be described as the universe's most expensive fingernails on the cosmos's largest chalkboard. The harmonic interference she generated by applying pressure at precisely the right frequency points caused the crystalline matrices to enter catastrophic resonance, which had the immediate effect of turning a carefully calibrated biometric amplifier into something resembling a psychic feedback weapon of unprecedented magnitude. 2 million spectators and several billion broadcast viewers simultaneously experienced what it felt like to have consciousness briefly merged with a human who had spent the last 3 days cataloging every exploitable weakness in Dominion technology, while being systematically underestimated by beings who thought longevity equaled intelligence. The sensory feedback loop lasted exactly 2.3 seconds. Which was apparently long enough for everyone connected to the broadcast to experience what the human was thinking at that precise moment. It was not as the Immortals had expected, thoughts of fear or despair or pleading for mercy. Instead, it was a complete tactical analysis of the amphitheater's structural weak points, a detailed assessment of the guard positioning, and what could only be described as a profound sense of professional disappointment in the Dominion's security protocol. The human, it became clear to every mind touching hers, had been spending her time in captivity not contemplating her fate, but rather conducting a comprehensive audit of Imperial defensive capabilities, and finding them wanting. The feedback surge overloaded the restraint system, which caused a cascade failure in the amphitheater's gravity control network, which in turn destabilized the atmospheric processors, which resulted in what the official incident report would later classify as spontaneous structural reorganization, due to user error. In more practical terms, a significant portion of the Grand Amphitheater collapsed, several thousand tons of exotic matter escaped containment, and Overlord Nexarian, who had been standing directly above the primary resonance point when the system failed, experienced what might generously be called rapid decompression, followed by gravitational redistribution. When the dust settled, the Overlord who had ruled for 8,000 years and considered himself a god was decorating the amphitheater walls in a pattern that strongly suggested mortality had caught up with him, despite his best efforts to avoid it. The human, meanwhile, was standing in the wreckage of her restraints, apparently unharmed and examining the exotic matter residue with professional curiosity. Fascinating, she said to no one in particular, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden I was wondering how you'd weaponize dark matter. Turns out you hadn't actually figured out the stabilization protocols. She looked up at the 2 million spectators who were staring at her in various states of shock, and smiled that same unsettling smile from the throne room. So, she said, conversationally, anyone else want to explain to me how your immortality works? Across the galaxy on 1,000 worlds, beings who had spent millennia in terrified submission to the eternal dominion were processing a single revolutionary thought: the gods could bleed, and if they could bleed, they could die. The eternal dominion had just discovered that their greatest weakness wasn't military or technological. It was that they'd started believing their own propaganda. The aftermath of what historians would later call the amphitheater incident unfolded with the kind of inexorable momentum usually associated with avalanches, economic collapses, and particularly determined natural disasters. Within 6 hours of the broadcast ending, the Dominion's carefully maintained information networks were buzzing with something they hadn't experienced in 12 millennia: uncensored discussion of recent events. The initial reports were cautious, almost apologetic in their uncertain, possible technical malfunction during state ceremony, read the first official bulletin. Minor structural damage to recreational facility. Overlord Nixarian temporarily unavailable for comment. The kind of bureaucratic doublespeak that had served the Dominion well when managing the occasional administrative hiccup, but proved somewhat inadequate when trying to explain why one of their supposedly immortal rulers was currently existing in several different locations simultaneously. By hour 12, the euphemisms had given way to increasingly creative attempts at damage control. Overlord Nixarian has transcended to a higher plane of existence, announced the Ministry of Divine Communication. His current distributed state represents a new evolution of immortal consciousness, which might have been believable if not for the fact that several billion beings had personally experienced the precise moment when his consciousness had stopped being distributed and started being splattered. The human, meanwhile, had been temporarily forgotten in the chaos. The surviving immortals were too busy trying to explain to their subjects why their god-king resembled abstract art to pay attention to one escaped prisoner, wandering the ruins of their most sacred venue. This oversight would prove to be roughly equivalent to losing track of a lit match in a fireworks factory. She had spent the intervening time doing what humans apparently did best when left unsupervised in alien facilities: conducting unauthorized research. The amphitheater's collapse had exposed several levels of infrastructure that were normally hidden from public view, including primary data conduits, power distribution networks, and what appeared to be a central communications hub that connected Athros Prime to every world in the Dominion. Any reasonable person might have used this access to call for help, send a message to Earth, or perhaps just try to find a way home. The human, displaying the kind of practical thinking that had gotten her species this far despite their best efforts to extinction themselves, had instead begun systematically downloading the Dominion's complete administrative database. 12,000 years of bureaucratic records, military reports, taxation schedules and interdepartmental memos were apparently exactly the kind of bedtime reading that human tactical minds found irresistible. By the time anyone thought to look for her, she had acquired enough classified information to write several comprehensive guides to overthrowing galactic empires, along with what appeared to be the personal communication codes of every major immortal in the power structure. The first sign that the situation was developing beyond simple damage control came when the tribute world started asking questions. Not the usual polite inquiries about taxation schedules or submission protocols, but increasingly pointed questions about the nature of immortality, the actual extent of Dominion military capabilities, and whether certain administrative policies might be open to negotiation. The second sign came when those questions evolved into statements. The hegemony of independent traders announced that they were reassessing their voluntary compliance status. The crystal hierarchies declared themselves temporarily autonomous pending clarification of divine authority structure. The warrior clans of the Rim began what they diplomatically termed routine military exercises in systems they hadn't been authorized to enter for 3 millennia. By day 3, the Eternal Dominion was experiencing something that hadn't occurred since its formation, organized resistance on a galactic scale. Planets that had submitted without question for millennia were suddenly discovering that their immortal overseers were neither immortal nor particularly capable of enforcing their authority when faced with coordinated rebellion. The tipping point came when Earth's response fleet arrived in the Athros system. The humans had taken their time organizing a proper rescue mission, which was understandable given that they'd recently been conquered by beings with technology roughly equivalent to magic. What they'd assembled was exactly the kind of force that species with limited resources, but unlimited determination tend to produce when someone captures one of their own. A collection of improvised weapons, retrofitted civilian vessels, and military hardware that had been designed by beings who'd spent their entire evolutionary history assuming that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing with more explosive force than was strictly necessary. The fleet that emerged from hyperspace above Athros Prime looked like it had been assembled by optimistic engineers working with spare parts and unlimited access to nuclear weapons, which as it turned out was exactly what it was. Admiral Chen's first communication to the Dominion Defense Forces was a masterpiece of diplomatic understatement. "This is Earth Fleet Command, requesting the immediate return of our personnel. We're prepared to discuss terms." The terms turned out to include detailed technical specifications for every major Dominion facility in the system, complete tactical assessments of their defensive capability, and what appeared to be step-by-step instructions for dismantling their government infrastructure without causing excessive collateral damage to civilian population. Information that could only have come from someone who had spent several days conducting unauthorized research in their most secure installation. The Immortal High Council's response was the kind of indignant bluster that beings accustomed to absolute authority tend to produce when faced with inconvenient facts. They would not negotiate with primitives. They would not acknowledge the legitimacy of inferior species. They would demonstrate the futility of resistance through overwhelming force. The human fleet's response was to begin systematically implementing the detailed facility shutdown procedures that someone had thoughtfully provided. Power grids failed in sequence, defense networks went offline, and communication systems experienced what the technical reports described as cascading user authentication failure. Within hours, the most heavily defended world in the galaxy was running on backup power and rapidly discovering that most of their backup systems had been designed by beings who'd never imagined that someone might actually want to turn them off. The final insult came when the planetary defense grid began broadcasting a looped message in several hundred languages. The Eternal Dominion regrets to inform all citizens that immortality has been temporarily discontinued due to technical difficulties. Normal mortality services will resume as soon as possible. We apologize for any inconvenience this may cause. When the human prisoner was finally located and retrieved by her own people, she was found in the ruins of the Dominion's Central Archive, apparently compiling what looked like an encyclopedia of galactic civilizations that had been conquered by beings suffering from terminal delusions of grandeur. Her first words to the rescue team were reportedly, "Did you know they kept detailed records of every species they've subjugated?" The psychological profiles alone are fascinating. I think I've figured out how to undo 12,000 years of imperial conditioning. Admiral Chen's final message to the surviving Immortals was brief and to the point. "Thank you for the educational experience. We'll be in." As the human fleet departed Athros Prime, leaving behind a galactic empire in the process of discovering that divine authority was considerably less divine than advertised, the universe settled back to contemplate the afternoon's entertainment. Somewhere in the cosmic background, the kind of vast intelligence that arranges for poetic justice on a galactic scale was probably chuckling at the exquisite irony of it all. The Immortals had wanted to make an example of humanity by breaking their most dangerous specimen in front of the entire galaxy. They'd succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, though not quite in the way they'd intended. They had indeed created an example that would be remembered across known space for millennia to come, just not the example they'd had in mind. After all, the universe has always had a weakness for stories about prideful gods learning the hard way that immortality is a significantly more temporary condition than most people realize. And if those gods happen to learn this lesson at the hands of a species that considers controlled explosions a reasonable solution to transportation problems, well, that just makes the story that much more entertaining.
The Eternal Dominion had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years. It took one human exactly 72 hours to explain to them why that had been a temporary arrangement.